This car is such a piece of... The history of the Ford Fiesta in Australia. Before I start this, I have to talk about this particular Fiesta. Usually I'll fix cars up and on seldom, but this one I had to give up on because it's been an absolute disaster, and I ended up having a blown ECU as well as other electrical problems, among other things, and it was just not financially viable to fix. So, getting back to the history of the Ford Fiesta in Australia. So, in Europe and the UK, the Ford Fiesta had a long and interesting history going back to 1976, but it wasn't until the 5th generation Ford Fiesta that the Fiesta was sold in Australia. This was because Ford was successfully selling the Ford Festiva, a car with an almost identical name, but it was a completely different car based off the Mazda 121. These Festivas were selling pretty good in Australia in the 90s, but Ford Australia decided to replace it with a more refined Fiesta from Europe. When Mazda stopped making the 121, it replaced it with the Mazda 2, which used the same platform as the Fiesta, funnily enough. The first model of Ford Fiesta to be sold in Australia was the 5th generation WP. I used to own one of these about 5 years ago. It was a good and surprisingly tough car. The WP was somewhat successful, although it did not sell as well as the Festiva it replaced. It was a much better car than the Festiva overall, and had the 1.6 litre petrol dual overhead cam Ford Duratec motor making 74 kilowatts and 146 Nm of torque. This was the only motor available on Australian models. They either had a 5-speed manual or a 4-speed auto. These were a German built car too, which not too many people know. My one was painted up to look like the Pacer from Wayne's World. It had electrical problems and was eventually sold off for parts after it died. The WP had an update in 2006 where it became the WQ. With the WP came the release of the Fiesta XR4, which is the same car as the Fiesta ST in Europe and the UK, but was branded as the XR4 to fit in with Ford Australia's model codes which they had named their performance vehicles. So the XR stood for performance, and the number behind it was the number of cylinders the motor had. They had the XR4 Fiesta, the XR5 Mondeo and Focus, the XR6, XR6 Turbo and XR8 Falcons. The XR4 Fiesta had a 2 litre 4-cylinder making 110 kilowatt and 190 Nm of torque. The WP Fiesta was replaced with the WS Fiesta, and it sold okay in Australia. They seem to be slightly more popular than the 5th gen models. These were now built in Thailand. The car in the video is a 6th gen WT Fiesta. It has some interesting modifications, most notably the really oversized wheels, installed by my mate who was the previous owner of the car, and also Jeep XJ Rhubar, which has been modified to fit, as you can't really get a Fiesta Rhubar unless you get one custom made. It was available with the same 1.6 litre Duratec as the WQ, but now making 88 kilowatts and 150 Nm of torque. A 1.4 litre Duratec was also available, making 71 kilowatts and 125 Nm of torque. And a 1.6 litre turbo diesel, which this one is. They were not very common in Australia. It used a Duratorque 4-cylinder, making 66 kilowatt and 200 Nm of torque. It was originally a Peugeot motor. At the time, the Econetic Fiesta was the most fuel efficient car on sale in Australia, using only 3.7 litres per 100 kilometres. This Fiesta is the CL and not the Econetic, so it doesn't have the amazing 3.7 litre per 100 fuel economy, but it still sits at an impressive and very impressive 4.4 litres per 100 kilometres. It has the same power and torque figures as the Econetic. Diesel models were only available with a 5-speed manual. Interestingly enough, petrol Fiestas had a 4x108 bolt pattern for their wheels, like most European cars, but diesel models had a 4x100 stud pattern, which is more common on Asian cars. Petrol models either had a 5-speed manual trans or a 6-speed automatic transmission, but this was a dual clutch transmission known as the power shift. Unlike a standard automatic that uses a torque converter, the power shift has 2 dry clutches similar to a manual transmission, which are operated by the transmission control module to engage and disengage at the right times. This transmission has been full of problems with the clutches slipping and the clutch actuators getting blocked up with clutch dust and not working properly. I used to work at a Ford joint, and this was by far the most common problem with Fiestas, and also Focuses too, which use the same transmission. If you are thinking of buying a Fiesta or a Focus with a power shift transmission, please for the love of God don't. The WS was fitted with electric power steering, where it had a large electric motor mounted on the steering column to assist with the steering, so no pump or fluid was needed. There were also now sedan models available, which were never as popular as the hatchbacks. The sedans were designed for the markets like the US, where hatchbacks are unpopular. There is a lot of room in the Fiesta considering how small it is on the outside, with a very big boot. One thing that I don't really like about the WS Fiesta is that it has no spare tyre, not even a donut, which the previous generation models had. All it has is an air compressor and tyre glue. If you have a Fiesta, I would highly recommend getting a full-size spare wheel for it. This seems to be a problem with a lot of modern cars designed for foreign markets with cities and not rural Australia. There was an update to the WT, which was called the WZ. It received a new front end as well as a few other things, and now it had a 1.5 litre making 82 kilowatt and 140 newton meters of torque, and also a 1 litre 3-cylinder making 92 kilowatt and 170 newton meters of torque. The ST model was introduced in the WZ, but was no longer called the XR4 as it was in the WQ. It had a 1.6 litre turbo making 134 kilowatts and 240 newton meters of torque. These STs were German built rather than the rest of the models on the Australian market, which were by now Thai built. At the time, Australia had a free trade agreement with Thailand, which led to a large number of Thai built cars on Australian shores, particularly utes. Diesel models were also dropped from the range when the WZ was released, so were the sedans. The 7th generation Fiestas were sold in Australia, but only the ST versions, which were the ones to get due to being the performance models, but they were never popular. They made 147 kilowatt and 320 newton meters of torque with a 1.5 litre EcoBoost 3-cylinder, which is pretty impressive for a 3-cylinder really. That's not too much off the original AU Falcon. This was also the end of the Ford Fiesta worldwide, with production ending in 2023 after 47 years. So really, a car like this was never built to drive the rough back roads of country Western Australia. They were designed for European cities, and this one was just unlucky enough to end up here. The Fiesta is one of the more forgotten cars Ford Australia ever sold. They were never as popular as the Festivas before them, and they got a bad rap due to the automatic transmissions in later models. You still see a lot of Fiestas on Australian roads, especially in the city areas where they are well suited. So is the Fiesta a good car? Well, I've got to say, with the exception of the dual clutch automatic models, which should be avoided with a 10-foot pole, they are okay cars, somewhat reliable and simple and nice to drive. Well, not this one with its oversized tyres, if it even drove. They have really good manual transmissions too, but they can also have electrical problems as well. Parts are easy to come by, and they are a relatively common car still. My personal opinion is that the 5th generation Fiesta is a better car than the 6th generation after owning both and working on countless Fiestas. The Fiesta has a terrible reputation in Australia. This is mostly due to the power shift transmissions. You can pick one up for under $5,000 on the current market, but there are better deals out there. Ford Fiesta, the speedo is not accurate, so I'll work it out later due to the oversized tyres. But 0 to 60 in the Ford Fiesta diesel with oversized tyres.